5,000 pounds of precision-guided destruction. Traveling through layers of rock, through reinforced concrete, through tunnels Iran spent years building in total secrecy. And then, silence, followed by an explosion so deep underground that the surface barely trembled. But what came out of those tunnels afterward was not fire. It was not smoke. It was nothing. Because there was nothing left. In a single night, the United States military did something that had never been done before in the history of modern warfare. It deployed a weapon that the world had never seen used in combat. And it aimed that weapon directly at the infrastructure Iran believed was untouchable. The infrastructure that gave Tehran the power to hold the entire global economy hostage. And here is what the headlines are not telling you. What happened that night was not just a military strike. It was the moment the entire foundation of Iran's strategic power began to collapse. And the consequences of that single night are still unfolding right now in ways that will affect oil prices, global trade routes, and the balance of power across the entire Middle East for years to come. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear is not speculation. Every detail matters. And by the end of this, you will understand exactly what is at stake, not just for Iran, not just for America, but for every country on Earth that depends on energy to function. To understand the scale of what just happened, you need to understand what Iran had built along the southern coastline. For years, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps constructed what they believed was the most sophisticated asymmetric defense system ever assembled by a regional power. This was not a simple military base. It was an entire fortress architecture buried beneath the earth. Tunnels drilled 30 to 40 meters deep into solid rock. Anti-ship missile batteries concealed behind natural terrain. Drone launch platforms hidden inside coastal inlets. Communication networks running entirely underground. Invisible to satellites, invisible to radar, invisible to everything. The centerpiece of this fortress was a family of anti-ship cruise missiles, the Noor, the Kosar, the Qadr, weapons specifically engineered to destroy large naval assets, aircraft carriers, destroyers, and commercial tankers, anything attempting to pass through a narrow strategic waterway. These missiles gave Iran something no regional power had ever truly possessed before: the credible ability to shut down 20% of the world's entire oil supply with a single order. That waterway is the Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, 2 shipping lanes, each barely 2 miles across. Through this corridor flows roughly 20 million barrels of crude oil every single day. According to analysts tracking global energy flows, that represents approximately 1/5 of all seaborne oil traded on Earth. Japan, South Korea, China, India, all of them breathing through this single narrow passage. For years, Iran's strategy worked, not because they fired those missiles, because they did not have to. The threat alone was enough to deter naval confrontations, enough to influence diplomatic negotiations, enough to make every American president think twice before escalating tensions in the Gulf. Iran called this strategy anti-access, area denial. And for 2 decades, it was perhaps the most effective deterrent a non-nuclear regional power had ever constructed. Then came the night of March 17th, 2026, and everything Iran believed about its own invulnerability was proven catastrophically wrong. But here is what most coverage is missing entirely. The strikes did not begin on March 17th. The preparation began days earlier, and it was invisible. Between March 13th and March 17th, American and Israeli intelligence networks built what can only be described as a digital cage around Iran's entire southern coastline. Satellites repositioned. High-altitude reconnaissance aircraft flew continuous overflights. Signals intelligence teams intercepted IRGC communications in real time, mapping not just the locations of facilities, but the precise depth of tunnels, the thickness of reinforcement, the exact coordinates of every underground structure worth targeting. By the time the first aircraft left the runway, the operation was already over in the minds of the planners. The targets were not estimated, they were not approximated. They were known to a degree of precision that military engineers describe simply as millimeter accuracy. And then came the weapon, the GBU-72, Advanced 5,000-pound penetrator. Let that weight settle for a moment. 5,000 pounds. More than 2 metric tons of precision-guided destruction, dropped from altitude, guided by GPS to within inches of its designated impact point, designed not to explode on contact but to travel, to push through earth, through rock, through reinforced concrete, traveling deep into the ground before its warhead detonates. This was the weapon's first use in actual combat, ever. The GBU-72 was designed to replace the GBU-28, which had been in service since 1991. According to defense analysts tracking the weapon's development, it is believed capable of penetrating in excess of 150 feet of earth before detonation. The tunnels Iran's engineers spent years constructing, 30, 40 meters deep, were not a challenge to this weapon. They were precisely the target it was designed for. The delivery platform was the F-15E Strike Eagle. Multiple aircraft, permanently forward deployed within U.S. Central Command's area of responsibility, flying paths that were far harder to track than heavy bombers departing from continental bases. The operation was designed to be fast, precise, and devastating before Iranian radar systems could fully process what was happening. And this is the part of the story that deserves far more attention than it is receiving. The United States did not act alone that night. Behind the GBU-72s, behind the Strike Eagles, behind the satellite targeting grids, was a crucial and almost entirely invisible partner. Israeli military intelligence had been sharing its signals network with the Pentagon in real time throughout the targeting phase. Israeli electronic warfare assets were deployed to blind Iranian radar installations and sever ground-based communication networks in the critical windows immediately before and during the strikes. Two intelligence architectures merged into a single operational picture, two militaries operating with the synchronization of a single force. The result was that the entire Hormuz strike package was completed without the loss of a single aircraft. What Iran had built over years in total secrecy was dismantled in hours. U.S. Central Command confirmed the strikes publicly that same evening. The statement was precise and deliberate. The forces had successfully employed multiple 5,000-pound deep penetrator munitions on hardened Iranian missile sites along Iran's coastline near the Strait of Hormuz. The anti-ship cruise missiles housed in those sites, the statement continued, no longer posed a risk to international shipping. An entire doctrine, years in construction, neutralized in a matter of hours, but the military operation along the strait was only one piece of a far larger campaign. And this is where the story becomes something much more significant than a single night of airstrikes. Operation Epic Fury had officially begun on February 28, 2026. And in the weeks that followed, the scope of what the United States unleashed was staggering. Over 7,000 Iranian military targets struck across the country. More than 100 Iranian naval vessels destroyed in the opening weeks alone, according to open-source data compiled by defense analysts tracking the conflict. Command infrastructure systematically degraded across multiple layers of the Iranian military hierarchy. On March 14th, 3 days before the Hormuz strikes, U.S. Air Force assets hit Karg Island, the island that handles roughly 90% of Iran's daily oil exports. The strikes confirmed more than 90 Iranian military targets destroyed on the island itself. But here is what made that operation significant beyond the military results. The oil infrastructure was deliberately left intact. That restraint was not an oversight. It was a signal. A message sent in the language that strategic planners understand better than any diplomatic cable. Washington was demonstrating, with absolute clarity, what it had not yet done, and therefore what it still could do. The Israeli dimension of the operation extended far beyond electronic warfare support along the strait. Israeli forces struck the Revolutionary Guard's naval headquarters in Tehran itself, the primary command center responsible for planning and coordinating all Iranian maritime operations. With that command structure destroyed, Iranian naval forces in the strait began operating without central coordination, described by military analysts as fragmented, reactive, increasingly improvised rather than strategic. The political consequences inside Iran were equally severe. Ali Larijani, one of the most consequential figures in the Iranian political system, and the man who had effectively assumed leadership following Supreme Leader Khamenei's death, was eliminated. His removal created what regional analysts described without exaggeration as a political earthquake inside Tehran's already fractured corridors of power. And yet, despite everything, Iran did not fold. And this is the part of the story that makes what comes next genuinely unpredictable. A U.S. Air Force F-15E Strike Eagle, call sign from the 494th Fighter Squadron, based at RAF Lakenheath in England, was shot down over Iran on April 3rd by a shoulder-fired missile. The crew ejected over hostile Iranian territory. What followed was one of the most complex combat search and rescue operations in American military history. Hundreds of special operations personnel, including Delta Force and SEAL Team 6, supported by more than 150 aircraft. The pilot was recovered within hours. The weapons systems officer, a colonel, survived days of evasion in the Zagros Mountains before being extracted. One aircraft down, one crew recovered. But the message was unmistakable. Iran, as degraded as its military apparatus had become, retained the capacity to inflict real losses. It had not been made helpless, and in the waters of the strait itself, the threat had not disappeared. It had evolved. Mines, suicide drones, fast attack boats operating without central command, in small autonomous clusters, harder to predict, harder to neutralize than a coordinated missile battery. And on the diplomatic front, the fractures in the Western alliance had become impossible to ignore. Days before the Hormuz strikes, President Trump reached out urgently to European and Asian partners with a historic request, a multinational naval force operating under NATO authority to keep the Strait of Hormuz open, nations whose own economies depended directly on unobstructed passage through that waterway. The response was, to put it plainly, a refusal. Germany declared the conflict was not their war. Spain closed diplomatic doors entirely. France, maintaining the largest European naval presence in the region, with the aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle and more than 10 ships forming a defensive shield across the eastern Mediterranean and Red Sea, announced those assets would remain exclusively defensive. Not one additional ship would be redirected to Hormuz operations. Trump told reporters from the Oval Office that NATO was making a very foolish mistake, and that he had long questioned whether NATO would be there when called upon. China, which received roughly a third of its petroleum through the Strait of Hormuz in 2024, remained behind a mask of calculated neutrality. Russia watched the rising crude prices with remarkable composure. Every dollar added to the oil price filled Moscow's war chest. Its incentive to see the strait reopen quickly was, to say the least, limited. Only India moved differently. New Delhi deployed more than half a dozen warships to escort its tankers through the escalating chaos. A pragmatic, consequential decision that broke ranks with the broader silence from Asian capitals. Faced with diplomatic paralysis, Washington resolved the problem the only way available to it, alone, with overwhelming force, and now with something more. On March 28th, U.S. Central Command officially confirmed that the USS Tripoli had entered its area of responsibility. 844 feet of amphibious assault ship, displacing more than 45,000 tons. Aboard it, the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, approximately 3,500 sailors and Marines, F-35B Lightning II, stealth fighters in its flight deck, the short takeoff and vertical landing variant of the most advanced fifth-generation combat aircraft in the American arsenal, MV-22 Osprey tiltrotor aircraft, AH-1Z Viper attack helicopters, CH-53 Sea Stallion heavy lift helicopters. Satellite imagery tracked the Tripoli transiting the South China Sea at unusually high speed, its escorts leaving larger than normal wakes. Open-source analysts described it simply as moving with purpose. The Tripoli was not alone. A second amphibious assault group centered on the USS Boxer, carrying the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit with roughly 2,500 additional personnel, was accelerated from the U.S. West Coast to join the theater. Together, these two Marine forces represent the largest American amphibious capability assembled in the Middle East in years. And every serious military analyst has reached the same conclusion about where this capability is pointed. Karg Island, 30 kilometers off the coast of Iran in the Persian Gulf, 8 kilometers long, the island that manages 90% of Iran's oil exports. The economic spine of the Iranian regime. Trump himself told the Financial Times at the end of March that Washington could take control of Iran's oil by occupying the island. On Truth Social, he threatened its obliteration. Pentagon assets, including A-10 Warthog ground attack aircraft and Apache helicopters, are already flying strike missions around Karg, methodically degrading Iranian defensive positions. LCSE hovercraft aboard the Tripoli can deliver Marines and armored vehicles directly to hostile shores at speed. The 82nd Airborne Division's immediate response force, approximately 2,000 paratroopers deployable within 18 hours, has been moved to the region. An airborne assault capability now layered on top of the amphibious assault capability already in place. On April 6th, Trump posted to Truth Social with a precision that left little room for interpretation. He set a specific deadline. He named specific targets, power plants, bridges. He wrote that Iran would be living in hell if the strait did not reopen, and that there would be nothing like it. Iran's senior officials responded with defiance. The strait would not reopen, they declared, until Iran was fully compensated for war damages. On April 2nd, Bahrain called on the United Nations Security Council to authorize military force to reopen the strait. On April 7th, Russia and China vetoed the resolution. That veto carried no operational relevance to the American military campaign already underway, but as a geopolitical signal, it was unmistakable. This conflict now carries the shape of a great power confrontation, fought through proxies, vetoes, and strategic positioning rather than direct military engagement. The global economic consequences of the strait's closure have already cascaded far beyond oil prices. Crude had been trading below $70 a barrel before Operation Epic Fury began. It surged above $100 within weeks, a rise of more than 40%. American drivers saw fuel prices climb roughly 25%. Shipping insurance premiums rose from fractional percentages of vessel value to levels where, by early March, no major insurer would cover the passage at any price. Gulf states, including Iraq and Kuwait, began curtailing oil production as storage facilities filled with crude that had nowhere to go. The cascading disruption hit Asian manufacturers dependent on Gulf energy, European consumers relying on Qatari LNG, fertilizer supply chains running through Gulf production hubs. The world built its modern infrastructure on the assumption that this waterway would always be open. That assumption is now being tested in real time. What remains unresolved is the question that every military analyst, every energy economist, every diplomat in Washington, Riyadh, Tel Aviv, and Beijing is asking right now: will the pressure become unbearable for Tehran before the USS Boxer arrives in theater? Will Trump's deadlines hold, or will diplomacy find a narrow opening before the next escalation? Trump's envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are reported to be in active negotiations with Iranian representatives, fragile and indirect, but ongoing. Pakistan's foreign minister has been on the phone with Tehran, urging dialogue. Iranian opposition figure Reza Pahlavi has called on Washington and Jerusalem to maintain pressure on the regime while protecting civilian infrastructure. Former Defense Secretary James Mattis has said publicly he does not believe regime change is likely. But what he and every other serious analyst acknowledges is that the strategic landscape Iran navigated for 2 decades no longer exists. The underground tunnels are destroyed. The command structure is degraded. The naval headquarters is gone. Key leadership has been eliminated. The proxy network is fragmented and operating without direction. And the largest American amphibious assault force assembled in the Middle East in a generation has not yet fully arrived. Iran built its deterrence on a single foundational assumption: that the cost of challenging it was too high. What Operation Epic Fury has demonstrated methodically and devastatingly is that the cost of not challenging it was higher. The GBU-72, a weapon the world had never seen deployed in combat before March 17, 2026, has permanently changed what is possible underground. The F-35Bs aboard the USS Tripoli have extended American precision air power to within striking distance of targets across Iran's western coastline. And the Boxer Amphibious Ready Group is still crossing the Pacific. Whatever comes next, whether a blockade of Karg Island, a Marine landing on its shores, a negotiated settlement reached under maximum military pressure, or an escalation that reshapes the entire region, it will be determined in the coming days. In nautical miles and negotiating deadlines, in the distance between a Marine amphibious force and a contested shoreline. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer the ultimate trump card Iran believed it to be. The card has been called, the bluff has been challenged, and the next move belongs to Tehran.